Click, subscribe.
Well, we all love comic books to the point where most of us spend money to read them. We love their form, their pictures, their storytelling, their creativity. But they weren't always there. Now, technically speaking, the Egyptian Hieroglyphics are some of the earliest visual sequential stories. But there is a picture storybook format that we call comics that has its roots going back to 1800s Europe. Now, first we have God's Revenge for Murder by John Reynolds in 1656. Now, this comic actually is in English and has caption boxes as well as images put together in a visual sequential narrative. Now, the next comic found in 1682 actually also has additional dialogue balloons. And no, it's not The Yellow Kid, which a lot of people think is the very first comic. That's ridiculous. It was actually in 1682 written by Francis Barlow, and that was a true narrative of the horrid, hellish, popish plot about the eventual arrest of Titus Oates. Now let's fast forward a bit to 1827 when Swiss writer-artist Rudolph Töpfer put together sequential art originally in French, which was actually reprinted in a Brother Jonathan extra in the United States. There was no actual copyright on it, and so there was actually just an ability to reprint a comic from Europe. And this came out in the early 1840s in the United States in New York City. This is thought to be the first American comic book. Check out an interior page. There's actually sequence, action, and reaction that makes it more like a comic book than the previous comics we showed you. Now, the comic art form became a fascinating new tool in 1860s Germany with Wilhelm Busch's mischief comic Max and Moritz, which influenced a young newspaper comic strip artist Rudolph Dirks, who immigrated to the United States and created the Katzenjammer Kids in 1897 about two friends, Hans and Fritz. Now, Rudolph Dirks originally worked on the Katzenjammer Kids for 15 years for William Randolph Hearst. However, according to his son in the 1970s in an interview, it was noted that Rudolph Dirks wanted to leave William Randolph Hearst for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World. There was a court case and a lawsuit, and Rudolph Dirks ended up winning the ability to transfer his characters to the new newspaper. However, he couldn't use the name. The name would then be kept by William Randolph Hearst. William Randolph Hearst would then hire the artist Kunner to continue the characters with the name Katzenjammer Kids. And then also Rudolph Dirks would then continue the stories of Hans and Fritz with a new name, which was Hans and Fritz. However, in World War I, because of the fight with the Germans, then he would then rename the strip to Captain and the Kids. And now there were two similar strips that were continuing in two various newspapers. However, someone in the United States would beat Rudolph Dirks to the comic strip race, and that was Ohio-born R.F. Outcault, who started making cartoons for the New York World back in 1889. Now, in 1895, R.F. Outcault created the Mickey Dugan character for Joseph Pulitzer's New York World in a comic strip called Hogan's Alley. In 1896, William Randolph Hearst wanted to compete with Joseph Pulitzer, and so hired away Pulitzer's publisher as well as his star artist, R.F. Outcault, who continued Mickey Dugan's adventures in the New York American, which was William Randolph Hearst's paper in a comic strip called The Yellow Kid. Now, William Randolph Hearst had gotten a multicolored press this year and wanted to put dazzling comic strip art into his comics to hook more readers. Now, Outcault made a special sequential interaction between the Yellow Kid and a parrot, with speech balloons that mimic the cadence of a discussion followed by the reader. Some feel that changed comics to a post-Outcault period that birthed the 20th century comic right at the end of the 19th century. Not because comics was a new technique, it actually already was around for a couple of hundred years by this time, but the character format cheap method to print many copies to package and sell to millions with fast presses opened up a new age of comic strips because it made a lot of money, and other copycat characters, and other artists joined in on the trend to make similar or more money. Now, ages can be defined with what new trends generate a lot of money. And in this case, the huge upsurge in cash started off a race with newspapers to generate as many catchy characters as could be and their comic book reprints to then suck in more readers, generate even more money, and this would start off the platinum age of comics. Now, as comic art storytelling is evolving, so also was commercialism, but also so were the legal lessons that a lot of artists and publishers would learn. So in 1896, R.F. Outcault applied for a copyright on the Yellow Kid, and he turned it into the Library of Congress, and it was actually denied, and that it was allowed for competing imagery of the Yellow Kid to continue. So there was Hogan's Alley still going on in Joseph Pulitzer's New York World, and then there was also the Yellow Kid that was continuing in William Randolph Hearst's New York Journal. Technically, the first newspaper, the New York World, should have copyrighted the character before the competing newspaper could have used the same character. This would have prevented a lot of brand marketplace confusion. However, that lesson was quickly learned. R.F. Outcault lost interest in the Yellow Kid and went off to create Buster Brown in 1902. Now, Outcault created Buster Brown for James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald, and eventually left that strip as well. Now, James Gordon Bennett hired an artist that many were thought to be inferior to the original artist. However, there was no apparent real drop in sales when the creator left, and this creates an interesting precedent where the character is actually worth more than the creator, and this would actually be shown in comics history time and time again. Now, R.F. Outcault continued to use the Buster Brown character, and this then set up another situation with two rival newspapers and competing similar imagery. However, there was a lawsuit, and both papers were able to continue it for different names. However, R.F. Outcault was awarded ancillary rights of the Buster Brown character, so he was able to utilize that name and character for merchandising. And he ended up setting a precedent where you can actually make more money off your creation in merchandising than the actual comic or art form itself. He actually licensed the Buster Brown character for shoes, watches, all sorts of paraphernalia, and made a lot of money that way. Now let's slip in another character in between the Yellow Kid and Buster Brown, and that was the unlucky hobo character, Happy Hooligan, created by Francis Burr Opper for the New York Herald, which was a William Randolph Hearst newspaper. Now what's important about this character is it was given a green light to make a film by the Thomas Edison Film Company, and that was the first movie based on a comic. This is the first time that a movie and a comic would synergize in a corporate brand. This is a precursor for a lot of the modern movies that are based on comic books. Now, the next comic strip artist we're going to highlight is Winsor McCay, an incredibly fast and skilled comic draftsman. He worked on 3 strips at the same time for James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald from 1905 to 1911, including his Little Nemo. He was so skilled that he could actually do satire of the form, like in this Sammy Sneeze strip where he breaks the fourth wall in a style that would befit Deadpool.
I see you out there.
Now, some legal background in Winsor McCay's Little Nemo in Slumberland. He of course started that in 1905 for James Gordon Bennett's New York Herald. He left that newspaper in 1911 and brought his characters with him for William Randolph Hearst's New York American. There was of course a lawsuit, and he was able to continue the characters but in a different name, in the Land of Wonderful Dreams. This, we see, is a pattern where an artist moves to a different newspaper and now both papers are using the same characters. However, Winsor McCay would create 2 milestones in comics. One was that the first newspaper failed without him, and only he could carry the quality of this particular comic strip, which he did for William Randolph Hearst. This created the first superstar comic artist, where literally the comic would fall apart without him. The second milestone was that he actually was one of the first animators. He was able to draw so fast that he drew thousands of stills for one of the first cartoons, and that was a Little Nemo cartoon. This is actually the first time that we have animation based on a comic, another corporate synergy product. Now in 1907, Bud Fisher created the character A. Mutt for the San Francisco Chronicle. Originally, this was a racing character, a gambling character. However, this evolved into one of the first popular horizontal daily comic strips. And this is important because this was a profitable format that many newspapers would copy. Bud Fisher would actually write copyright on this character before he left the San Francisco Chronicle for, again, William Randolph Hearst's San Francisco Examiner. So he actually owned the rights to his own character under everybody's noses. Bud Fisher was so good at the legal system that he actually submitted the copyright at Washington, D.C., which was granted. And then when the previous newspaper, the Chronicle, tried to continue the adventures of A. Mutt, he challenged them legally and actually won and was able to get them to cease and desist. Now, Bud Fisher also then created a co-star, and that was Jeff. And this then evolved the comic strip into Mutt and Jeff. And this odd couple format actually worked really well in the comics, that it also worked well later in TVs and movies. Now, Bud Fisher signed a 5-year contract with Hearst, but when that deal was up, he then moved on to the Wheeler Syndicate for a much more lucrative deal. Now, this, of course, angered William Randolph Hearst, who then tried to copyright the characters Mutt and Jeff under Bud Fisher's nose. However, because Bud Fisher had already the original copyright, no courts would grant Hearst the rights to continue that character. And Hearst actually took this up to the Supreme Court, who then would refuse to overrule the lower courts. And this then gave Bud Fisher undisputed commercial and merchandising rights to his own comic character. This then actually set up a huge precedent that when the artist owns the creation, then the lucrative deals immediately follow. And this would be actually the kindling for entities like the Image Revolution. In Steranko's History of Comics, he writes that the first comic book was a 1911 Chicago newspaper strip reprint of Mutt and Jeff. And this actually was very successful. And this then showed the merchants that comic book reprints are very profitable. Now, another funny milestone from Bud Fisher is that in Mutt and Jeff, he actually put himself in the comic, and he's interacting with his own characters. And you would see things like this with Stan Lee, Jack Kirby, and John Byrne. You also see that he addresses fans who are never happy with what he does. And so now we have this issue of unhappy fandom and how it's constantly an issue and a headache for artists. This is yet another milestone that we actually still see even in modern comics. Now, after Bud Fisher, we enter the realm of the 1910s to the 1940s. And we would want to highlight one of the main artists of this time, and that was George Herriman of the Krazy Kat comic strip. Now, the Krazy Kat comic strip is interesting because it introduces the love triangle. You would have Krazy Kat, who loved Ignatz the Mouse. Ignatz the Mouse did not love Krazy Kat. Officer Bullpup loved Krazy Kat. So no one was happy. There was never a period of resolution of this tension. And this would be present in Archie comics, where Betty liked Archie. But then when Veronica was introduced into the comic strip, it was a lot more interesting because Veronica loved herself, Archie loved Veronica, and Betty loved Archie. This is the sort of love triangle that actually works in comics, and actually Stan Lee and John Romita would introduce this to Spider-Man, and that would actually increase sales in comics. This was a technique that dates way back, much farther back than Spider-Man. And Tim Sale would actually reprint this love triangle in a story he did with Jeff Loeb. Now let's expand more on George Herriman from the Krazy Kat newspaper strip. Now he was actually descended from partial African American ancestry. When he was born in 1880, his birth certificate said colored. He was light-skinned enough to schmooze with the predominantly Caucasian newspaper crowd at the time, starting in 1897 working on comics. His fellow artists thought him Greek due to his black curly hair, and he was able to mix into the crowd and earn himself a success with his artistry. Now, before Krazy Kat, he ironically made a strip in 1902 called Musical Mose about a black man in typical and very unfortunate blackface who tried unsuccessfully to pass himself off as white. This makes for a close-up look of how much work had to be done for African American equality, as well as the constant struggle of the lighter-skinned mixed people of the time, ingratiating into society by denying their racial heritage. Here is also a picture of Herriman from the same year as this newspaper strip with his new bride, Mabel. Now, similar to Art Spiegelman's Mouse in 1986, Krazy Kat digs into some pretty deep questions, but in a more whimsical way, almost like the 1957 Cat in the Hat by Dr. Seuss. Look at this daily, where he explores the topic of sexuality, and you can see that there's an interesting approach to what some would consider an eternal question. As fun as it is watching Deadpool or Sammy Sneeze break the fourth wall, George Herriman actually had Krazy Kat do the same thing. As you can see in this daily, he has a very large ink blot overcoming the panel. This creates a satire on the comic form. Now, the next newspaper comic strip that would elevate the art and form of storytelling in comics was Polly and Her Pals by comic artist Cliff Sterrett. Now, this comic was present for the majority of the first half of the 20th century, starting in 1912. It was notable in that it actually was a family situational comedy, which was a formula used in a lot of later TV shows. But however, after a decade or so, the comic storytelling got more sophisticated. Instead of living room comedy, it turned into artistic depictions of emotions, astral projection type of emotions that you would see in the comics. Now check out this Sunday from 1927, actually showing nighttime in Polly's family's house from their cat's perspective, utilizing some abstract imagery which seems to express something along the lines of the cabinet of Dr. Caligari. Now going further into the Doctor Strange aesthetic is depicting emotions in an astral fashion. Now, not exactly astral projection, but he's able to put human emotions into an astral projection form in his Sundays. Here is one from 1928 where Polly's pa is going through his dental appointment, and the surreal depiction of his fears and psychological dissociation during the in-office procedure are just priceless. Now, these astral emotions are used with some great dreamland techniques that Cliff Sterrett puts into his stories. Here's one segment from 1928 of Polly's pa entering dreamland and encountering his own personal insecurity with his daughter's boyfriend. It is the metaphysical aspect that is interesting, and later iterations of dreamland or astral plane or nightmare world are just as fascinating here as they would be in later comics like Doctor Strange or the Sandman. Now, Polly and Her Pals also shows an example of a newspaper comic strip ending a visual sequential comedy or adventure storyline with a verbal punchline like this,
"Enough said,"
which would be used by people like Stan Lee decades later. It is important to note that comic storytelling, as well as owning a reoccurring character, monetization, merchandising rights, even using buzzwords like "Nuff said," all of that was pioneered by the early comic strip creators, and that modern comic book artists, writers, and publishers stand on the shoulders of these giants.
Click, subscribe.